My name's Herbert Byam. I am a content marketing manager for the North America's market. I got into publishing 3 years ago and I've loved it ever since.
No, I'm Ruthann. I'm the social media marketing manager for the Americas region at Taylor and Francis.
My name is Roxanna Pebdani. I am an associate professor at the University of Sydney. I've been here for just about 4.5, almost actually coming up on 5 years, which is very exciting. I teach or work in the field of rehabilitation counselling, which is a disability-focused field. So my research is on sexuality and disability, so kind of the ability to be a sexual being, as well as kind of pregnancy and fertility for people with disabilities, some kind of work in the LGBTQI space as well. And so just kind of making sure that people with disabilities are given the opportunity to be for full participation in life, including kind of sexuality, is a disability focus if that's what you want to do, that kind of stuff.
How did you end up in academia?
I don't think this was what I always wanted to do. What happened was I decided to go into psychology/counseling, ended up in the field of rehab counseling, and then picked a research topic. And I was like, oh, this is really exciting. And so my path kind of like built itself. So it was the second year of my master's where I was like, I've just done a 2-year master's degree and I've barely talked about sex. And I think sex is important. It's part of everybody's lives. And why are we not having this conversation? And so then I started that research topic and then started a PhD and then kind of went into academia. And it's kind of just rolled from there. So I'm not sure that there was as much of an aha moment as maybe would feel comforting, but I'm quite happy in what I do. I really love being an academic. And I recognize that the path to academia is not all roses and it's not the same for everyone. And there are a lot of kind of inequities that are happening that make it very difficult for people to make that path. And I think there's, we're graduating a lot of students who might not have a career in the future. And so the first question I always have with a new PhD student is, what do you want to do when you finish? And will this help you get there? Because if it won't, it might not be worth it for you. But if it will, if it's going to get you the step you need at work, or if then of course it's a great step.
How did COVID affect your path in academia?
I would love to see the future studies that come out about 3 years in a pandemic world and how that affects like us as people and how we process things. And like even in publishing, there was what we called a COVID boom where people were like just producing all of this cutting edge research. And we saw leaps and bounds and submissions. And it's like, wow, like I know that the pandemic was just a profound moment in all of our lives, but it's just, we don't really know how it affected us.
Yeah, I think the mental piece of COVID is going to be really interesting, particularly as kind of the parent of small children, thinking about how their lives were changed so much compared to other kids. But also my kids are 14 months apart. And so they never hurt for a play date. They always had each other. And I think there are some kids who maybe were by themselves and that's going to affect them differently. And I think ultimately we were quite fortunate. And you talk about that publishing boom and not to, go full academic and mention my own paper, but yeah, so those submissions were largely from men, right? So there was a huge boom in publishing by men and the kind of inequities in how that impacted parents and particularly mothers is something that we wrote a paper on. It was published late last year. I think it was, in like actual paper print. How's that still a thing, by the way? But anyway, it's in paper print as of maybe a month or two ago. But it was one of those things where, we looked at what parents were doing, or we looked at what academics were doing with their time. We sampled them randomly 6 times a day. And we heard when we let people kind of respond with different things. So I'm doing teaching, I'm doing research, I'm caring for kids, I'm, taking care of my house, whatever. And so people were able to say what their primary activity was and what their secondary activity was. Mothers were almost 5 times as likely to be caring for their kids. They were much more likely to be multitasking by caring for the kids and doing something else. And I can tell you, having had kids crawl all over me in meetings and all kinds of things that, yeah, I mean, there was just a lot of that happening. We saw people's lives in a very different way, which I think was beautiful, but quite a lot for people. And then access to uninterrupted time. So any academics out there who, need some time to sit down and think before they write, which is totally me, right? I need to be able to, like, I need a chunk of time to do research. And I know there are people who are like, I can do research in an hour. I'm not one of those people. I need some time. And so to have so little access to uninterrupted time, where like kids would come for my husband and I were working in the same room. The kids would come for quote unquote both of us, but they would come for me, right? Like it was like, Mom, I need whatever. It's just different. And I'm not, and I think the kind of one of the big flaws in our paper is that it was looking at only heterosexual couples, or kind of assuming heterosexuality. We didn't take into account people who, like, we weren't able to incorporate data from people who were non-binary just because of our statistical analyses couldn't handle that from our sample, because our sample, it's not perfect, but I think it does provide a really good shot as to why submissions looked very different during that time, as we saw. And that resonated so much with people. So I have moms like constantly talking about the paper or tweeting about it, and it was a big deal. COVID was a thing and still is, right? I mean, like this time last year, it was our winter and the kids were sick every week. We didn't go a full week without somebody home sick for 3 months. And that's really impactful on your work.
There are definitely a lot of inequalities that we see in academia. What other inequalities do you typically see, and what do you think contributes to that?
There's a whole host of research on the differential expectations of women or in the academic workforce. So like women are more likely to take on academic housekeeping, more likely to be asked to take notes. I mean, we see this in any work setting, I think. It's really interesting because a lot of that research is not terribly intersectional. So we're looking just at gender, and there's so much more at play here that we're just not doing a great job with yet. I know some people are, but and I think part of it is, those stats are really complicated. You need a really, 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 really big sample to start kind of making really solid and more intersectional kind of statements about how inequalities play out. And so there's a lot of work on gender specifically, thinking about, who takes on the advising of students, or who students are more likely to come to. So, and like, this is not a complaint, but as a brown woman, having worked at a university with a lot of students who are also brown, whether that be Latino or Latina, or Middle Eastern, or anyway, with different minoritized students, a lot of students came to me for different things because I was approachable, and it's beautiful. It's wonderful. It's so great to have someone you can, I've had students say, like, it's so good to see someone who looks like me, who's doing this. And so I there are huge benefits to it, but a lot of that that's not what's going to get you ahead in your career is, that advising. There's a whole book, but there's a book, I think it's called, it's the Black Academic's Guide to Winning Tenure Without Losing Your Soul. And it's a great book. It's a great book. And I'm not Black, but the ideas are so good and so important and very widely applicable to minoritized academics. I think the other thing that, having had friends who were first in family to go to university, that's another huge inequality. And I think one of my friends was just posting about a paper, a news article that was talking about how in order to get into some of the very prestigious universities, kids are like high school students are publishing. And there's like this almost like pay to publish. But just thinking about how many of my fellow PhD classmates had parents with PhDs. And so you all automatically know how to navigate it. I think inequities are really reflected in what we see in society and I think academia kind of maybe magnifies them because there's just a lot out there.
I would love to get your thoughts on what you would change in academia.
I look around at my colleagues at the University of Sydney, and I think we're a very diverse group in many, many ways, but I'm sure we're missing quite a lot. And I think the thing that I would change is increasing access to the table. So making sure that there are more people with more experiences and more ideas who are sitting at the table and are able to give their input and are valued for that. I worry that this is going to be not the most helpful to other people answer. But so my kids are 5 and 6 now. When we moved to Sydney, they were 6 months and 20 months. So they were little. And I kind of just said, there are certain things I can't do in the evenings and on the weekends. So like when my daughter was 3 months old at my last job, I was, proofreading a grant application and reading it to her because I was like, well, that's reading, right? We're reading together. This is good for you. And I came here and I was like, maybe that's not the right way. And so I have, I've tried to set pretty strong boundaries where I try not to, there are certain things that happen, I'm on one of the boards for our national organization. Those meetings are in the evening, but I try not to sit and do hours of work on the weekends anymore. And I think it helps that the kids are young enough that they still make me very tired. And so when they go to bed, I'm like, I'm not really sure that I would accomplish much at this point. Like my brain doesn't work terribly well after that time. And so I'm able to kind of preserve that because I'm sure that I will be more efficient in the morning. That said, I have colleagues who will tell you that I do email late at night or in the morning or on the weekends, but that they're typically things that can be managed. So I'm happy to respond. They're things that can be managed relatively quickly. I'm not sitting down at my desk to spend an hour on a very detailed response that will have to come tomorrow. There are things that are urgent, right? When COVID happened and I was in an education leadership position, and we had hundreds of staff members who were trying to move their classes online on a very short notice. I mean, the balance has not always been there. I do my best to implement it where I can. And so my new home goal is family reading time because I love reading for fun. And I just want us all to sit on the couch and read quietly. Just read your book. Please read your book so I can read mine.
Yeah, I would love a sanctioned reading time at work. Sure. Yeah, even out of work. I would love to be able to spend an hour of each of my nights reading. What are some of the most memorable moments of your academic career?
I think we talked about high points and low points, and I kind of want to start with low points. I'm fortunate to have a job, right? Like that's kind of the state of academia today is that like not everybody gets a job. And I did not get a job my first year on the market. I just really want to normalize that. We're rejected all the time. Papers get rejected, grants get rejected, you get rejected from a job. You're just part of academia is what persistence and, growing a thick skin. I think my low point was, feeling really worried about not getting a job my first year on the market. I think a high point was a grant that we got. It was granted the 30th of September, 2016. And I remember that because my daughter was born 3.5 weeks later or something like that. And so I was some colleagues and we put together this like really cool interdisciplinary grant and it was a really exciting project. And it was my first very large kind of pot of funding. And I had this undergrad student that I hired on that project who then went on to be a master's student and like, just, really thrived. And that was just a really, really fun opportunity. And also kind of the stress of that was like not great timing because I was in the US and you get some leave, but not the same amount as you would in Australia. But like the grant needed to move forward. But in some ways it was good timing because like ethics and stuff, IRB takes time. And so it worked out and it was very, very exciting. And I remember the university wanted to take a photograph of the team and I brought Layla in and I was like put her in the photo and instead she was asleep and so we're like we're not going to wake the baby but there's this photograph where I'm like oh yeah I have like a 3-week-old in that photo just off the side just out of the camera screen celebrating this big grant that we had gotten. It was a really cool project on kind of exercise for people with spinal cord injury and like as we had a colleague in engineering doing like wearables for exercise and colleagues in kinesiology, and we supported a ton of students with that project, not just my students, but also students in kinesiology. It was just a really fun project.
I saw that you took her to a conference.
Yeah, she's a well-traveled, look, both of my kids are well-traveled. And actually one of my like parenting tips is if you have a baby, and it's different with COVID now, I think we were much more lax about having babies around lots of people. And so maybe this wouldn't be something someone would want to do. But I've never had more people stop at my poster than when I had a baby in my arms. They're like, oh, poster presentation, but Roxy has a baby. I'm going to go say hi to the baby. That's like my pro tip is bring a baby to a poster presentation and people will totally say hi to you and like talk to you for a while. And they'll even listen to your research while cooing at the baby. So I'm really curious about the corporate structure of Taylor and Francis, because like to me, we send journals over, we understand their editors, associate editors, we understand reviewers, but there's this whole kind of massive monolith behind it that we're just not, maybe that's just me, that I'm not across. I'd love to hear more about.
Like you talk about editors and associate editors and peer reviewers, and like that's all this stuff that's like I'm not really hands-on with. But like in terms of like corporate structure of Taylor and Francis, I know that there's a board of directors and they oversee various departments like marketing or editorial or sales or production. Our goal is always to make it as easy as possible for researchers to get from point A to point B. It does get a little tough on our side just because like we're building websites, we're building ads, we're out on social, we're trying to record podcasts, we're trying to be in Twitter spaces, we're trying to do all of these things. It's like what really resonates with academia, what really resonates with researchers, and what we're finding is that it's changing rapidly, because like we're pushing for TikToks, we're pushing for new media, just because we know that the next generation of researchers is going to be Gen Z, they're going to be digital, they're going to be always online, and we're just trying to do our best to get to them.
I think that we can really only give our perspective from the marketing side, but I can tell you from the social media side that's seen what's happened with Twitter. There have been so many changes, new platforms popping up all the time. And I think as an academic, you really keep your finger on the pulse, basically, if you want to communicate your research on those platforms. Make sure that you're actually having a presence on social media and engaging with other people within your field. It's super, super important. I see a lot of people who kind of just pop up when they want to promote something and then sort of disappear. But I don't think that will really have the effect that you're looking for. You have to actually be social on social media. So it's important to, just be active.
I've been really quiet on social media lately, and I think I'd like to build it back up. But part of it is like not knowing what to post, right? I mean, there are a lot of things in my life, particularly a lot of like my job, where it's like, you don't need to hear about the fact that I was in 6 hours of meetings today. Like that's boring and dumb. Like,
yeah, I think it's funny that you talk about people not wanting to hear about you being in meetings for 6 hours, but I think that's actually totally fine to talk about on social. I think if you talk about how difficult it can be, that's actually really authentic rather than just sort of sugarcoating all the great aspects, just getting published. I would say just talk about whatever you would actually engage with yourself.
I like that. One of our like very high up leaders posted a picture of a sunrise this morning. And I think she does that a lot. I just kind of don't feel like my life is that interesting.
Your life is amazing. I mean, you were just in Antarctica.
The trip of a lifetime. Would go back 110%.
What was the most memorable moment from that trip?
It took us a very long time to get to Ushuaia, which is where you leave from. So we flew from Sydney to Auckland to Santiago to Buenos Aires. We spent a day and a half, which was quite fun as well. And then down to Ushuaia. And then you go 2 days across the Drake Passage, which is like one of the most tumultuous passings in the world. And so it was like this very rocky and nauseating and a difficult passing. And then you get there and all of a sudden you're like, walking around on snow and ice, and there are penguins everywhere. And I just love penguins. And so we first were around a bunch of Gentoo penguins where, they were just waddling around and being adorable. And then we saw a couple of chin-strap penguins, and we saw, other animals. And I should remember what we saw, but really I was just obsessed with the penguins. Sometimes I think I should do another PhD in penguins, but that's a whole different story. And so then we, you go from place to place because, staying in one place is kind of boring. So you go and you see, icebergs in a different place, and you see a different part of the land and so on. Finally, on day 2 or 3 in Antarctica specifically, we saw Adelie penguins, and they're just a little smaller and they're faster and they're just so much cuter. They're like probably the cutest penguins I've ever seen. So I've seen fairy penguins, and they're so little, they're kind of like slow and waddly, but like the Adelie penguins were just very agile and they would kind of run, and then they would slide, slide, and then they'd get back up and they'd run, and then they'd slide on their bellies. And it was just the cutest thing. For me, it was the Adelie penguins that were just like absolute highlights. And also my favorite color is blue, and there's so much blue. It's just like different shades of blue everywhere. It was absolutely stunning. I've been a lot of places and I've never seen anything as beautiful. Ice formations and big icebergs, little icebergs, mind-blowing.
I feel like you could just post about penguins and get thousands of followers and then just sneak your paper in there once in a while.
That's a good idea. I might do that. Because I do still have a bunch of the photos on my phone. You have to like pick when you go to Antarctica as well. So like penguins just kind of poop where they stand, right? So then it starts looking really gross later in the season.
Speaking of future PhDs, what research questions do you hope to explore in the future?
Look, I have a couple of PhD students doing some really exciting work. I just posted a video of one of my students who I'm supposed to be meeting with in just a few minutes, who's working on a qualitative project on using dance as a modality to reduce chronic pain. He's in the middle of this really exciting qualitative project, and qualitative work takes ages. And so he's in the process. He posted this video of like kind of cutting down codes and pasting them on the wall and rearranging them and moving them around, and then a little bit of stretching and then getting back to it. And it's just this really fun kind of view of what qualitative research looks like down the line. He'd already done a lot of the back work that it all takes a long time. But I really liked that video. I have a student who's submitting her PhD in next Tuesday, which is super exciting. So yeah, we have a lot of really cool projects happening. I have a student who's working on how people who are LGBTQI get any sort of kind of sex related counseling post-stroke. So there's just so much really interesting work happening. Most of my work kind of being in sex, sexuality, and pregnancy and fertility. Potential student who's really interested in pregnancy for people with spinal cord injury, which I think big ideas in that space. And I'm hoping to seek some funding for a PhD student on that. I guess like the biggest issue is how do you make the work that you do useful for the people it affects? And so part of it, one of the things I really like to do is figure out how to train doctors on being more competent with people with different types of disabilities, or not assuming that if you have a disability that you wouldn't be having sex, and how do we really improve people's lives with the work that we're doing?
That's like the marketing message I would want to get to people, right? I want people to see how your research changes things for people and makes life better. What's the best advice you could give to the next generation of researchers?
I don't know that I have best advice, but that might be imposter syndrome. And maybe my best advice should be related to imposter syndrome and how you probably have more to offer than you realize. First of all, considering why you want a PhD is the first step for going for a PhD. And I think that's really important, because if the PhD isn't going to get you where you want to go or get you to what you want to do, it might not be worth it. It is a big undertaking. It can be really difficult to move forward if you don't have the motivation that's inherent in, oh, I want this job, or this is going to help me with this thing. And it doesn't always have to be academia. It isn't always academia. There are many, many reasons that a person could want a PhD, but being very clear about why you want it, make a Twitter profile, and to use it to varying degrees of success. Some people just don't like that modality at all, but doing our best. But then also maybe it's TikTok. Maybe we need to be, maybe I need to get with the times. My best advice, choose an advisor or a supervisor or a mentor who has your best interests at heart. It might not be the person who has the best research. You want somebody who has your back and who has a vested interest in you and in your success. That's my advice. Kurt Johnson from the University of Washington was my postdoc advisor. And honestly, if we're going to be really honest about struggles, when I started my postdoc, I was going through a bout of depression and pretty serious anxiety. And Kurt was just like, that's okay, we can work through this, we'll figure it out. And was super patient with me when I wasn't terribly productive at the beginning of it. It was actually a really special thing that he did for me. In my master's, it was Jim Bellini, who's a huge rehab researcher as well. So Kurt does a lot of work in MS research. Jim is kind of rehab counseling research broadly. Right now, my head of school has had my back in a way that has just been incredible. And then I also think finding colleagues who are wonderful mentors or that build a wonderful community is really important. So a shout out to Mel, a great person Mel Keep believes in me more than I believe in myself. Ryan Naylor. I think there's like this perception that academia is full of people who are like not super nice and not super great, but that has not been my experience, and I feel really fortunate for that. What's your advice to up and coming researchers?
My best advice as a non-academic is to not be afraid of failure. That's just part of the process, and there's so much that you can actually learn from failures.
Building a social media presence will go a long way. It will not replace an actual human support system, but having a little bit of a following just to give you that extra push will do wonders for your, not only your confidence, but also getting your research out there and getting it to people who can use it.
There are plenty of communities that you can be a part of where you can get that positivity that you need. Don't be afraid to reach out.